actually not so much talking about my book, which is nice, kind of mixing it up a little bit. And I'm talking, as Ron had mentioned, about an article I wrote several years ago. I believe it was in 2019, that explored part of the witch hunt that I think had been left out, which is really what happens afterwards. I, of course, then included part of it in my biography of Rebecca Nurse, but it was something that we have so many books of 1692 that either end at the end of 1692 or the beginning of 1693. Some might move on until the early 1700s, about 20 years after the witch hunt, when they finally officially start clearing some names of the victims of the witch hunt, but they don't get them all at that point. And then that's it. It's as if the story is over. Now, all of the victims of the witch hunt, I should say in 1692, you're going to have 19 people hanged, 1 pressed to death, at least 5 die in jail, and the total accused is almost 200 people. Well, after the witch hunt, those who survive don't really go anywhere, and most of them stay around where they had lived previously. Those who are executed, you have their family members who are continuing to live on their farms, and how do they deal with remembering their loved one who has passed away in this great tragedy? With the witch hunt, one of the best authentic historical sites associated with this event is the Rebecca Nurse Homestead in Danvers, the only home of a victim of the witch hunt that's preserved and open to the public. There are a couple other homes of victims of the witch hunt that do still exist, have not been preserved, and some are in poor state of repair, and others just look like a modern house, so not really a authentic historical site to visit. In the cemetery at the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, it was long presumed that Rebecca Nurse was buried there by her family after she's executed in 1692. And a few years back, I, on behalf of the museum, was working on a project trying to get some grants, and we were restoring stones in the cemetery, headstones, footstones, the monuments, which was successfully completed, fortunately. It took several years. And while I was down there, it gave the cemetery a look that I never quite had before. The most recent marker in the cemetery is that of George Jacobs. He is executed for witchcraft in August of 1692, and he has this nice reproduction headstone. He was buried there in 1992, that's not a typo. And they gave him a stone in good 17th century style. It's got a skull on it, it's carved, it has his name written as you would have. And that was his final resting place, a memorial to his legacy. It seems fitting, it seems proper, it seems good, except right in the same cemetery, we have the memorial to Rebecca Nurse. Both of these people are just as innocent, just as much victims of the witch hunt, yet we have this real stark contrast of unequal legacies. And that was really the question that got me started on that article. And that's the question we're going to kind of look into tonight. Is these two victims same spot, but remembered in a very different way? Now, there's a couple parts that we'll talk about. I don't usually have a table of contents, but I guess as an academic article, it's always divided into 3 parts. What causes the disparity between the memorialization, their time during the witch hunt, how it's similar, how it's different, and then lastly the memorialization, which is really the heart of our topic here. These two victims have a lot in common. They both, of course, maintain their innocence. When they are accused of witchcraft in the spring of 1692, both of them have reactions of really pure surprise that they could be accused. They were people who had not had many of the typical things in their past that might lead one to be accused of witchcraft. They never had, for example, conflicts with the church. Their families had been really tight-knit and together. No political disputes that could have led to such a thing, and so both are shocking. Both of these people are elderly at the time by 1692 standards. with a significantly shorter life expectancy. We have Rebecca Nurse, who's 71, and then George Jacobs, who's early to mid 80s. We have a less certain birth date for him. And both of these people are first generation settlers, that they are born across the ocean in England and they have come here. They are grandparents in 1692. They've had 2 more generations. Their backgrounds are similar. They're both farmers in Salem Village, what's now Danvers. There's no economic disparity. After the witch hunt, they're both positively portrayed by historians because they are innocent and wrongly executed. So of course, we have 2 sympathetic historical figures, and both have a really strong physical legacy. It's not that after 1692 they disappear without a trace, or the family dies off and nobody's left. No, no, no. Their families are present. Their families are living either on or next to their original farms and very much present in the Danvers community. In fact, in this category, George Jacobs actually has the benefit of this comparison. His family is still on his original farm, and we have items belonging to him, we know, that still exist. With Rebecca Nurse, the Rebecca Nurse homestead has many items from the family, but you can't prove one item was held by Rebecca Nurse. You know, it could have been her daughter's item, her son's item, her husband's item. We don't know of anything that belongs to her. With George Jacobs, we have his canes that are in the Peabody Essex Museum. He walked with 2 canes. We also know that when his family in 1692 reburied him, we knew where it was. Whereas with Rebecca Nurse, we just knew it was somewhere on the farm. So if there was ever a case for somebody to get a monument to them, you would have thought it was George Jacobs. And you would have thought he would have gotten one a lot earlier than 1992, 300 years later. Now, of course, a difference between our 2 historical figures. The first one is, of course, gender. We have an English man and an English woman. With witch hunts overall, the large majority of people accused of witchcraft were women. Historians have gone through and done a lot of statistics on what would make one most likely to be accused of witchcraft, whether it's socioeconomic status, religious status, political events at the time. And with my quote here from a really great book about women and witchcraft, The Devil in the Shape of a Woman, that out of what we know, about 78% were women. So overwhelmingly so. What's interesting is in the late 1800s, as we have the movement for suffrage, we have a lot of female writers in the United States, England also, we're kind of sticking to the United States tonight, I guess, who kind of re-examine witch hunts in colonial New England and view it as, as oppression and unfair treatment by the authorities, of course. And this was something that had been put forward as a reason of why Rebecca Nurse was remembered, that it sort of intersects with the women's rights movement in the late 19th century. That does not give Nurse this benefit, because the first book really pushing that theory comes 8 years after Nurse's memorial is built. So it's not really that sort of explanation for us. Another difference, of course, if we talk about Salem, there is always money to be made nowadays with Salem tourism. And you have to examine, well, could either family have had an economic benefit by constructing a memorial to their ancestor, anything like that? And the answer is definitely no. Both of them lived in Danvers, not downtown Salem. Really what we're talking about in the 1800s is far too soon for the Salem tourism. It's nothing like today. So that's not a reason. And what I came to as a conclusion is the reason these 2 people are remembered differently, which I'll explore in a moment, is the actions of their family members. I know some of you may have been here as I talked about Nurse, who had the best defense at her trial when accused of witchcraft, really because her family supports her. That is really key to her case, and it's what made her case kind of unique compared to others, the strong family support. What we see is George Jacobs doesn't get that. And that was the thread that I saw that causes our disparity here. In particular, we're going to talk in a moment about his granddaughter Margaret, who will essentially turn against him when he is accused of witchcraft. So our story, Salem Village, I had made a little map years ago as part of this journal article of where the Nurse family lived. This was the original Nurse family farm. The Nurse homesteads off Pine Street in Danvers. This is downtown Salem. That's downtown Danvers. And George Jacobs lives over here. It's really not a great distance from one another in our discussion. We have our, I guess, a better map to show the difference between it and downtown Salem. Now, overall, I mentioned the number of people accused. I had said at least 172. There are now historians who actually do put that number a little higher, closer to 200. But 172 we know for sure. All of these people accused are all innocent. And the specific accusation of witchcraft is, well, it's very specific to Puritanism. They believed that someone who is a witch had literally signed a contract with the devil. That he showed up in your house one night with a book and a pen and handed it to you. And you signed your name as an employment contract. The Puritans are very legalistic. They also really, really like to sue one another. Legalistic in that way. But yeah, it's a job, so of course you signed a contract. And what you get out of it is the idea that you get, they don't say supernatural, to them that's blasphemous, but they say preternatural, which basically just means supernatural, powers to hurt people. And if, by signing your name, that's sort of your like payment or compensation. Now, no God-fearing Puritan would ever dream of doing such a thing. Witchcraft is the worst thing that a 17th century Puritan in Massachusetts can be accused of. It's considered more heinous than murder because it's the evilness of cooperating with the devil, whereas the overwhelming majority of people in Massachusetts are Puritans. Massachusetts is settled by the Puritans, and they really want to keep it for the Puritans. Our witch hunt begins in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister in Salem Village. This is all that remains of it today is the foundation. It was torn down around the time of the American Revolution, so it is a long gone historical structure. And if you're familiar with the witch hunt, in this home we start to have two young women, Betty and Abigail, begin to be unwell, having fits, flailing, saying they see things. These actions will spread to others, and eventually it's the adults, not them, who decide it's witchcraft and decide to treat this as witchcraft. First it's treated as an illness, but when they can't have doctors determine what illness it is, they can't figure it out, then it's determined to be witchcraft. And although the first couple people who are afflicted or allegedly harmed by witchcraft are teenagers, it's adult-led from the start. There's a lot of television specials that make it seem like a gaggle of teenage girls is somehow running this or controlling this or doing this on purpose, and those are really misrepresentations. With this home, we'll have a couple people accused in February of 1692 from Salem Village. Nurse is then accused in March. When first told that she's accused of witchcraft, again, we're going to have both of them as utter shock that somebody could accuse them. She says she's as innocent as the child unborn. She's brought in for questioning March 24th, which the anniversary is coming up in a few days, so about a week. And these are her original accusers. After these original accusers, this will be supported also by adults who testify against her. It's very much adult-led. Unfortunately, despite her family supporting her, once you're accused of witchcraft, once you're put on trial, there's no way out. They expected you to prove your innocence rather than the prosecution prove your guilt, the opposite of how we would, like to run a courtroom. And you just couldn't dig yourself out of that everybody believes in witchcraft, everybody sees young women and then adults also acting or behaving as if they're being hurt, and they believe it. And then those people point the fingers at somebody and they see this chain of events and they have no other explanation than it must be true and it must be witchcraft. All right, moving on to George Jacobs. So George Jacobs, always as a historian, you never want to put a question mark on a basic fact about somebody. But we are just so early in the settlement of Massachusetts that, yeah, we don't We don't really know when he was born. He is accused 2 months after Nurse. Once it has really gotten rolling, by the time we get to May, so Rebecca Nurse was the 5th person accused. By the time we're into May, we've had more than 24 accused. We're into the 3rd dozen of people accused. It's going and it's spreading. It's other towns. It's not just Salem Village. It's not just the city of Salem. We're really kind of building up to the height of the witch hunt. Now, his accusers, one of the prime ones, right off the bat, is a lot older than those who accused Nurse. We have a 20-year-old that really makes the initial seeming accusation, or the first one taken credibly. They call him a dreadful wizard, is what is written in the court papers sworn out for his arrest. That is the phrase they use against him. And just like Rebecca Nurse, he says he's innocent. He says, well, burn me or hang me, I will stand in the truth of Christ, I know nothing of it, it being witchcraft. That's what he says before the 2 judges, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, right after his arrest, when he has his first appearance before the judges. I have here a photo of his house that is in the 1890s. It was someone named Frank Cousins in the 1890s who was one of the first real pioneers of like photography in the North Shore, also kind of Boston area, and who took it upon himself and his assistant, who's in some of these, to document old structures or monuments or cemeteries. So for a lot of the Salem witch trials related stuff, these 1890s photos are the earliest photos. He did them with a piece of technology that's amazing. I remember once I saw the glass negatives, and instead of, a negative, if you think of like, I would say a modern camera, maybe not that modern, but one that uses film, and the negative is maybe the size of your thumb. These negatives are this big. This is excellent because on a lot of his images, now that they've been digitized, you can zoom in with such high level of detail that amazingly these 1890s photos are way better than you'd ever imagine. His granddaughter is a tragic figure in the witch hunt, but one who makes a very unfortunate decision. Margaret Jacobs is about the age of a lot of the young women that accuse her grandfather. She knows them. You didn't really go to school back then, but they would have been the same people her age. Some of them live vaguely nearby. Salem Village, really not a big place. So these are people she would have been acquainted with. Now, when she's accused, or she's arrested, I should say, the same day as her grandfather's mentioned first, and then after that accusation's taken seriously, then she is accused. And we have great insight into the workings of the witch hunt. At the top, we have a gentleman talking to George Jacobs. When the 2 Jacobs are arrested, they're kept in separate rooms. She appears before the judges without her grandfather being present. So this guy, Joseph Flint, who lives kind of along like Peabody, Danvers line now, he has to go and tell George Jacobs that his granddaughter, in front of the judges, has falsely confessed to witchcraft. And she does so because she thinks it's going to save her skin. She is really here one of the first to think that would benefit you. All of the first people who are accused of witchcraft deny it fervently. As I said, it's sort of the most horrific crime that a Puritan could ever be accused of because it is so blasphemous according to their belief of witchcraft in 1692. Now, she specifically mentions that she set her hand, or put her signature, in the devil's book, exactly what she would have been accused of. Now, George Jacobs is going to be in jail. He's transferred between a few. Margaret Jacobs is in jail, transferred between the 2. And it would have been kind of fascinating to see how, if they're both in the same jail at the same time, and the jail is one big room, how would those family conversations have gone? You always wish you had a few more documents here to kind of like really get to the heart of the story. What happens is Jacobs goes on trial that summer. He goes on trial the same week as John Proctor in early August. And they are convicted, as the court convicts everyone in 1692. And they know that the next execution date where there'll be about half a dozen of them who are found guilty, will be executed, is mid-August. It's going to end up being August 19th. Well, Margaret Jacobs is in jail and has this real sense of remorse. It turns out she also testifies against John Proctor, not family related, and we're not quite sure if she had even known John Proctor before this happens, but she testifies against him and her grandfather. We have a record of her going to the jail after the guilty verdicts. And what she says is, we actually have it, she apparently told John Proctor in person. We don't know if she told her grandfather in person. But she writes a letter of her recantation that she said in the jail room that everything she said was a lie against her grandfather and against John Proctor. Now, it is too late. They have been convicted, and there were other people testifying against them. It's not that this was the only evidence against them, in which case you might throw out the trial. You still should have thrown out the trial, of course, not fair. But here you kind of see how somebody thought back then when they're accused. The accusers told me if I would not confess, I'd be put down into the dungeon and be hanged, but if I would confess, I should have my life. And then she says, and maybe make the confession. And then the key part, as she's writing to the judges here, what I said was altogether false against my grandfather, but the Lord, charging it to my conscience, made me in so much horror that I could not contain myself before I had denied my confession, choosing rather death with a quiet conscience than to live with such horror which I could not suffer. She is in that jail room agonizing as her conscience is telling her what such a horrible thing she has done to these people. What's interesting about it is we might think, well, finally she did the right thing, and finally we have someone during the witch hunt that's, telling the truth, which is refreshing out of most of these accusations. The part you might not get on first reading is that choosing rather death, she expects that by recanting her confession, she'll be put on trial next and hanged. She thinks that she is jeopardizing her own life at this point by confessing, and that's probably what made her wait so long, because she thinks the noose is waiting for her as well. With the events that follow, George Jacobs hanged anyway, despite the judges getting this letter. He's reburied on his family farm. It's believed that one of his sons did so, removed his body from the execution site, which back then was right outside downtown Salem, off of Boston Street, and reburied in Danvers Port. With Margaret, she is never put on trial for her life during the main part of the witch hunt. The court will be stopped that fall, and she's one of the cases in jail still waiting for her trial. Once the court is stopped and a new court is put into place, they will be a lot more skeptical of these accusations. It's described that they use words about like lacking understanding or something. It seems as though there may have been some sort of like mental breakdown on her part that you can't quite be sure of, because they're using the mental health language in 1692 is not really that enlightening. So it's often told in euphemism that something is wrong, and she will be let off eventually the following year. So she never suffers that consequence that she fears. Now, we're getting to the memorialization. These two, overall, I should say, are in a sense, in the year 2025, the most memorialized, the most remembered out of the 25 who are either killed or died in jail during the witch hunt. We have a lot of similarities again after 1692. Both families petitioned the state legislature to clear their names. They are already executed. It's an exoneration that is much too late, but it happens. They'll be cleared. Now, I don't consider this memorialization in the sense that they're doing it for George Jacobs or doing it for Rebecca Nurse. If you read the language of their families' petitions to the legislature, a lot of it has to do with the family name. Their descendants are looking out for themselves. If Rebecca Nurse is known infamously as someone guilty of witchcraft, her children and grandchildren with the last name Nurse kind of think there's a shadow upon them. So this is a little self-serving. It's not purely to remember their ancestor. There is kind of a practical element. They mention infamy, their reputations, and their posterity. Here's the actual act that will clear their names. So we have October 1711. I underlined Jacobs and Nurse. We have the vast majority of those who were convicted. Also, we have Abigail Faulkner, Mary Lacey, Sarah Good, Mary Esty, Rebecca Nurse's sister. Now, they don't actually include everybody's name. You may have heard a couple of years ago, two years ago, that they cleared the one of the final names of those who were convicted in 1692. I think it was the summer of 2022 that this was done. It was someone from North Andover named Elizabeth, and she was cleared in the fiscal year 2023 state budget as an add-on. I mean, however it gets passed, that's fine, but that's really not, I think, the way that most people expected that to get passed. Now, with Nurse, time passes. Family lives in Danvers. The family lives on the Nurse farm. Eventually they sell it to some cousins, but still descendants of the Nurse family, same concept. And it's here that we get that giant memorial in the Nurse cemetery. It's something that was really not in keeping with the time. It's an outlier. It's something that's unexpected. It was not fashionable in the late 19th century to put up monuments to really like ordinary people, not a president, not a governor, not someone of that high status, I guess I'll say, but an ordinary person in a historical event. Now, obviously a really important one, somebody who has maintained their innocence in light of an entire community assuming they're guilty, a strong person, an important figure in American history, but not one with a title. So right away we have something that's different, untypical. It's untypical, moreover, that nobody in North America had ever been accused of witchcraft and then had some sort of memorial remembering them. It had never been done. It said that at the time it had never been done anywhere in the Western world. Even in Europe, that has unfortunately executed thousands, far worse than in Salem, nobody has been remembered and memorialized. To make a claim about the whole Western world is kind of a claim that's impossible to prove. So I say North America because I want to be, as strictly researched as we can be. Here we have members of her family, but most importantly, I would say, in light of the unlikeliness of the memorials, those are also just a bunch of ordinary people from Danvers who lived in her neighborhood later and decided to donate money to this memorial to somebody from their town they thought was wrong and they thought should be remembered. This is not the town as an official body building a memorial. It's not the state building a memorial. It's a bunch of people who kept getting together, kept having fundraisers, and hey, they raised enough money and they pulled it off. And the idea that this is a grassroots effort, I think, very much adds significance to it. We got a little program from the dedication of the monument. Day 1885 is when it's dedicated. They get John Greenleaf Whittier, who at that moment is really the most famous American poet that is alive to write the inscription. He also lives down the street, which is helpful. He lived at Oak Knoll in Danvers, which was right not too far from the Rebecca Nurse homestead, so he was easy to get. We got the Boston Globe reporting on it. What I found amazing about this is the idea that we think in 2025, people across America, they've all heard of the Salem witch trials. Maybe in high school they read The Crucible, or in English class, or maybe it came up in their history class. It's an event that everybody's heard of, everybody has some level of understanding of. I talk to people who visit Salem regarding the history of the witch hunt all the time. And everybody has sort of a different perspective, a different spin on it, but everybody knows what it is. What's amazing is in the 1880s, that was also true, that this was already such a known event. When Nurse has a memorial dedicated to her, it's reported in newspapers all over the earth. This is not a Danvers story, it's not a Salem story, a Massachusetts story. Because it's the first one, it catches headlines. We have Le Petit Journal in Paris, which is one of their largest newspapers at that point in time. I don't believe it still exists, but at that point it was like the newspaper, writing about Rebecca Nurse in Danvers, Massachusetts, and this memorial dedicated to her. I have another example of, in the United States, with so many German immigrants in the upper Midwest, I guess. We have here in Minnesota, even the German language newspapers are writing about Rebecca Nurse, never mind the English language ones. The New York Times has seemingly like 24 stories about this. They were there for all the fundraisers ahead of time. They were there at the dedication. They even come back when they dedicate another monument to some of her supporters. This is known far beyond what I ever imagined would actually be known. And at the dedication, we also get to our issue whenever we talk about the witch hunt of, is it Danvers or Salem? And it is something that can rile up a lot of people. There are people in Salem who are guides who might overemphasize the role of the city of Salem in the witch hunt. Then there are others today who say, nothing really happened here, it all happened in Danvers. And I mean, both of those perspectives are wrong and flawed, both matter. One thing that historians recently have been writing about is the general topic of memorialization, which is why I was so surprised that there was not really much on the witch trials with this. We have one analysis done of the Salem phenomenon overall, the witch hunt, and later memory, that I thought was spectacularly wrong, in a way that you wouldn't expect. When Nurse's monument is dedicated, they invite 2 ministers to talk that day. The minister from downtown Salem, which was actually the church Rebecca Nurse attended most of her life, the First Church of Salem, and then the First Church of Danvers, the one that's right next to the Rebecca Nurse homestead. That was the church Reverend Paris was the minister at when the whole witch hunt began, basically in his living room. And of course, they're both given an opportunity to talk. Seems great. What's amazing is you have 2 radically different directions here. You have here Charles Rice, the First Church of Danvers pastor, and he points out that there's a real public interest also with every man demanding that public errors of the past should stand in the light and be reproved. We should point out bad things we did before, so we learn from it and don't do it again. This doesn't seem like a bold statement. I think that's why we study history, is, be better, hopefully. What's amazing is the pastor from Salem gets up there, he talks for several minutes, kind of just says nothing. And this is sort of counterintuitive, that somehow the Danvers community can come to grips with this horrible event earlier than those in Salem can. Were you to walk around today, you would have assumed the city of Salem came to grips with this first, and then, went past that into various kinds of tourism. But it actually took them longer, despite Salem Village having more people accused, more people executed, more families still living there. All right, George Jacobs, kind of as our final segment here. Excuse me. Jacobs really had that unfortunate case in the witch hunt. And it stands out that there are only a few other people who, when they were accused of witchcraft, have a real stab in the back or betrayal by a family member. He isn't the only one, but it really is heart-wrenching of his own granddaughter turning on him. So his family will return to his farm. His son and daughter-in-law were also accused of witchcraft. She had been arrested. He fled. Kind of left her behind, I guess, but he fled. She has an unfortunate experience, the daughter-in-law, of because her husband fled, the sheriff is going to try to seize his belongings. really a way to stop you from fleeing or to try to get you to come back. And allegedly, the sheriff takes the wedding ring off her finger because that was her husband's property, and he even seizes that. So you have this real like denigration, unfortunately, of the accused also. You then have their children, George Jacobs' other grandchildren. He has more than just Margaret, that are left. Mom's in jail, dad's on the run. You just have these little kids under 10, and there's no one to care for them, that the neighbors, it seems, stepped in and did so. But once they all return, they reburied George Jacobs, and they know exactly where they buried him. It's kind of where three fields come together. They picked a point. It's not in a cemetery. They didn't really seem to have a family cemetery on their farm. So what's interesting is you knew the exact point. Generation after generation after generation has heard the story of the witch hunt, and nobody does anything. Not just a monument like Nurse, there's no headstone. There really isn't a marker. It was said that there was a rock just near the corner of the fence, and that's it. With this sort of indignity, it gets a lot worse. It's going to go downhill pretty fast, actually, for George Jacobs. His family decides later on they might sell the field with great-granddad buried in the corner of it. Well, there's someone who's going to purchase it, who apparently has heard this story, because it's common knowledge around Danversport that old George Jacobs is buried there. And the buyer wants to know for sure, am I buying a field with a 1600s dead body in it that I'm then, plowing up and using, and that's weird. So in 1854, the family digs him up. They knew the spot, they had a rock, and they just get a bunch of shovels and they dig him up. And they do find him. So as we continue here, his body is the only one, and of course we can only be, 99% sure, but we're quite sure it's him. It's the only body of any of the victims of the witch hunt that is ever found and is ever recovered. So it's unique in this way. They say he's in a good state of preservation, which I shudder to think about quite what that means. But word gets out. I don't know if the newspaper guy was there when they dug him up or not, but it will end up in newspapers all over the place. I found one in Virginia. Now, in the 1850s, people down south, as we're having real sectional tension between the North and the South, always liked to tell the abolitionists in the North, you think you're so good, you think you're so morally right, what about all those witches you killed? That was a real pushback against the abolitionists. So of course the Richmond newspaper is going to really go into this story with a political motive. What they end up doing is they just rebury him. They still don't give him a headstone. They just put him back where they found him. The field is not sold out of the family. It is kept in the family, but that's about the only nice thing that they've done. And it continues, I should say, we have a little bottle. Glass bottle, and if you can read the script, it says, Bones of George Jacobs. They decided not to rebury all of him. Really not sure who's in charge of this operation. They took what they believed to be a finger bone and a nail that they assumed had been part of a coffin, that the coffin was long gone by the 1800s. And they put it in this bottle. It's red wax stopper at the end, so it is really sealed. And they put a little note inside. And this is kept in a house in Danversport for about 60 years. It's 1902 that it'll be given to a museum. And with that, it's really just kept in a wealthier homes, typically at the end of the 19th century, had a little cabinet of curiosities, a curio cabinet where you might have a family heirloom, some historic artifact, and this woman had George Jacobs' finger. In 1902, it got donated to the Essex Institute, and then the Peabody Essex Museum today. What's interesting, though, when they do dig up George Jacobs, it makes an impact, really apparently not on his family. But wider than that, people in Salem at the Essex Institute hear about this, and they express interest in paying for a memorial to go on the Jacobs family farm for him. Nothing ends up coming of it, but there are historians, there are historically interested people that think this is a problem. What we get out of it, though, is one of the most famous paintings of the witch hunt, the examination, the trial of George Jacobs. Tompkins Madison has another really similar painting, but it's a woman standing down front, and there's like lightning bolts. It's basically the same concept here. And I mean, Jacobs is such a sympathetic figure. He's down on one knee. He's begging, pleading with the judges. I mean, their view of him is not that he's a bad guy in the story, because he's not. But it's a really sympathetic one, but nothing happens other than someone buys the painting, they donate it to the Essex Institute, and it hung in their library for 150 years, until then the PEM moved their collections from Salem to Rowley, and they don't have a reading room in Salem anymore. 50 years passes. After his finger is donated to the Essex Institute, you have a gentleman, one of his descendants, who donates his 2 canes to the Essex Institute. It's still in the PEM collection. His family's living on his farm through the Great Depression. And when we get into the 1940s, his family is interested in selling. There was some hope that maybe it could be preserved by the organization that now is called Historic New England. Maybe they could be able to save it. The Essex Institute at that point didn't really own stuff in other towns, so they still really don't, other than a couple old houses in downtown Salem, so they weren't really in on it. But at the end of the house, what happens is the family leaves it vacant for quite a while, and it's a vacant home, and it eventually burns down. It's also struck by lightning, and so we have here, it's totally ruined. These photos were taken, it says HABS at the top, the Historic American Building Survey, which was one of those New Deal projects to document historic places around the United States. So they did architectural drawings of what the inside looked like, as well as they photographed the whole outside. But at this point, there's nothing to save. Now, we get to the 40s, we get to the 50s, and seemingly every town near us, too far, every town near us, of course, is going to become a suburb. Wow. You have a vacant farm, not too far out of downtown Salem. Of course, a real estate person buys it and wants to put in house lots, a development. So here we're not in 1855, but we're instead 1954. And sure, his house is demolished, all the fences are gone, the whole land is being flattened, and it's time to dig your cellar. Well, what does the bulldozer find except George Jacobs? Yet another indignity packed on here, that his family, even the last owners of the Jacobs farm, knew that he was there when they sold it, didn't take any precautions or do anything. They apparently probably didn't tell the new owner, or at least not the bulldozer driver, because it's a surprise to them. They have to get the Danvers police in on this, because you can't just find a dead body and not report it. I really am fascinated as to what the Danvers police must have said about this. What a weird call. We found somebody who died in 1692. I'm like, well, what are they supposed to do about this? They do a little examination of, they know it's not a recent death. They had heard this story about George Jacobs. No, they don't think this is some recent murder or some recent crime. And then they don't want him. What are they going to do with them? This is a weird situation. So you have George Jacobs in a box. And this box travels too much. First, it's given to a wealthy lawyer in Danvers who was involved with the Historical Society. He was one of the people who got the town, if you've ever been, to save Endicott Park from development off of 95 in Danvers. Acres and acres saved as a park with a historic structure in the middle. And he's given this box. Okay, well, he doesn't really know what to do with this. He keeps it in his dining room, under his dining room table. Now, eventually, he is sort of forced into not keeping it there because, again, a wealthy guy in a nice house His hired help threatens to quit until they get the dead body out of the dining room, which is a reasonable workplace request, I would think. I mean, I'm on their side with that. That's obviously a problem. And he doesn't really know what to do with it, so he takes it to the town, but the town doesn't own a cemetery in Danvers. Well, what's going to happen? So there's a nonprofit cemetery near the library, and they take him, and they put him in a stone building. Again, he's still just in this box, this like wooden box. It's not this big, because it is just bones that are remaining at that point. And this old stone building had been used in winters. You know, way back in the day, if somebody passes away in the winter, it might be too cold with the frozen ground to open a grave, and so they kept people for maybe a week or two until they could then be buried. Well, he's just in this building. He'll be there for quite a while until we get to the 1970s. And eventually the cemetery decides that, almost as if they thought that there might be some liability on their part of having this unclaimed dead body, they give it to somebody in Danvers interested in local history and basically say, you might know what to do with this. You can take on this project. And so it ends up in a house again. It ends up in a house. We're talking for another 15, almost 20 years. I mentioned he's not reburied till 1992, so that's our amount of time that's ticking on here. He, interestingly, will be examined. His bones will be examined by a doctor, a pathologist from one of the Boston hospitals, which is important because, as we've been going through talking about this, you've probably been wondering how are we actually sure it is him, not just some random other person that may have been buried in the 1600s. Well, the doctor found that, and it's interesting that with this examination, there's no transcript. Again, you know, we're supposed to have a dead body. So the exam is just set into a tape recorder, and there's no signed documents. With it, the doctor describes his bones, and in particular his legs, and describes somebody of the right age, the right ethnicity, clearly suffering greatly from arthritis in the legs. We know he walks with 2 canes. They knew the age, approximate age, that definitely fit, and that there were so few people who were that old in Salem Village at the time, never mind lived on that farm. His burial, separate. His burial alone, not what Puritans typically did. So right away you have somebody who for some reason is an outlier. And all of these pieces come together that George Jacobs is really the only person that could fit this profile. And that you have the family story since they buried him that he was there. And so all of this scientific examination does corroborate what had always been said. Unfortunately, with his, well, it's very fortunate, he's eventually buried. The unfortunate part is we think of not many years later having great access to DNA technology, that he is reburied before really that level of science could ever be used on him. But he's not buried yet. He's still in this person's house. What's interesting is I know that you guys had done a St. Patrick's Day event with the Danvers Historical Society a couple days ago. I wasn't able to go. With that, the Historical Society in Danvers used to do events on Saturday mornings, as we're talking about like the 1980s. And what they would do is it was part historical display, and it was part antique sale. And each Saturday had a theme. They would get from town, it was a revolutionary theme. Some people who owned items related to Danvers, the American Revolution, that they'd have on a big display table. And then this is held in the Danvers High cafeteria. And then on the other tables, people would be selling antiques to benefit the Historical Society. It was a fundraiser. Well, one Saturday, they wanted to do witch trials theme. And back then, museums apparently were way freer with loaning items. They got the Essex Institute to donate George Jacobs' canes. They had like a briefcase from Judge John Hathorne. They had an item from one of the other judges to have on their front table, and George Jacobs in a glass box. And that was their little display. I did go to Danvers High School, and I just think it's wild that that was in a cafeteria. Eventually, obviously, this is becoming problematic, as if it wasn't on day one problematic. And what ends up happening is it's the Rebecca Nurse Homestead that agrees to take him in. There is that family cemetery where they believed all along the Rebecca Nurse is buried. Nobody knows the exact spot, but somewhere in the cemetery she's buried there. George Jacobs is not a family member, but hey, you have another victim of the witch hunt. There is a corner where nobody's buried. It seems fitting as part of the tercentennial of the 300th anniversary in 1992 to rebury him there. And that's how that comes into play. With the 300th anniversary, the first time George Jacobs is really ever memorialized is on the big memorial in Danvers to all the victims of the witch hunt. That's the first time his name is ever carved in stone, because that's March of that year. Then we get to August, and he is finally reburied. With this, the Rebecca Nurse Homestead has an exact copy of the Salem Village Meeting House, where the original church would have met, and they had a service in there, a Puritan-style funeral, burial service, which actually makes him the only victim of the witch hunt to ever get that. Far too late and not the same as in 1692, but as close as one could do. And then he's reburied. So you see a better picture of his stone and how it is carved in such a great 17th century style, the slate, the designs. It would fit in the Charter Street burial ground in Salem with like John Hathorne's and the other people from the time. And they have his quote on it professing his innocence, which is an important testament to him. But even as we get to 1992, it's not his descendants that are organizing this, it's just other people in town. As it happens, they will find some descendants of his. There are them still around, not just Danvers, but the North Shore in Massachusetts, and they do attend, but it was still not them leading that effort, which is fascinating. And with my conclusion, I really do think it has to do with their family members. Here, as we get back to the slide upon which we began. It's easy for the Nurse family to remember Rebecca Nurse because all of their ancestors worked to help her. With George Jacobs, you can't remember him without remembering your other ancestor, his granddaughter, who betrays him in front of the court. And that her actions there, although it leads to his death, are something that makes him less easy to remember among their descendants. And that is probably what's led us to such a really distinct memorialization, just like mere feet apart from one another. That is what I wanted to speak with you all about this evening. I'd be happy to take any and all questions about this, about other aspects of the witch hunt. That's all fine. But I wanted to thank Ron. I wanted to thank the Lynnfield Historical Society for inviting me back. It's great to be with you this evening. Thank you.
What we'd like to do is have Dan pull the raffle winner
Oh, sure.
for his book. And we'd like to pass around, Linda, did you pass around take the collection for the La Calabrita? Oh, okay, okay, so let's pass that around. And this is a donation to make Easter baskets for Fortune.
Oh, yeah, okay. No wonder I couldn't understand.
Okay, pull our winner out. Kevin McCauley. Kevin McCauley. Save right now. Do we know if that's the real building that they had the or whatever you call that, the examinations in?
Sure. I guess I don't have a photo in this deck of slides. There's a structure in Danvers right across from the First Church. It's the corner of Hobart Street and Center Street. That is believed to be a home it was the original tavern in Salem Village, really the crossroads of the village. And in Ingersoll's tavern, Ingersoll is the owner. In his tavern, many of the people who were arrested were held until the judges came out. They had to ride out from downtown Salem in order for you to have your appearance before the judges. And there's other accusations that are made in his bar room. Fits in the bar room, people saying they see strange things, even stranger than people in a bar room might see. And in terms of the structure, so the question being how original the home is. The home has currently come up because it is deteriorating. It's basically abandoned and has been for like 12 years, maybe even more, like 14 years. It's someone out of state who purchased it that doesn't live in Denver. And in terms of the structure, it was definitely remodeled around the 1750s. It's really common in our North Shore area that first period houses all had like real makeovers in the 1740s and 1750s. So in terms of things like what you would see in the walls or trim or woodwork, I would not imagine any of that is before 1740. In terms of the bones of the building and presumably the foundations, it's believed that it is original. Nobody has ever done dendrochronology to date the wood, which would be the only scientific way to know for sure. But that most first period homes, that's never been done because it costs thousands and thousands of dollars to do this. And this current owner won't even keep a full roof on it, so he's of course not paying for dendrochronology. So it's always been believed so. It's put on the National Register with that description that it is the original one. When it was listed on the National Register, the previous owner, 50 years ago, had people come in, examine it. People were in the attic, they were in the cellar, and that was their determination then. So I do assume that it is. I know of no reason why not, although it's never been scientifically dated.
Okay. So, question, you got a question here?
Yes, just a question about, did they have court reporters back then? How were the quotes of these innocent people recorded? Was there somebody writing it all down, like a court reporter today?
That's a good question. And when it comes to historical events, we always want to think about where are the sources for this? Where are we getting this information? So interestingly, we do not have the play-by-play, line-by-line of the final jury trials. We do have the line-by-line of their first appearance before the judges. So that's what he said, his quotes, the first day he appeared before the judges, the day that he's arrested. There was somebody appointed to record. It varied. It's a different person on a different day. It sometimes could be, I think with his case actually, it was someone that came out from downtown Salem. In Salem Village, the first couple, it's actually the minister, Reverend Paris, who kept the notes. It's the people who they knew could write well, which is few and far between at that point in time, but of course the minister could. You have other documents that when accusations are made, a lot of the accusations are by women who couldn't write, and that they'd have a male family member write their accusations, which always leads you to think, was that exactly what they said? Has this been changed? And that's something we can't ever really fully know. And same with the court reporter. In the case of Rebecca Nurse, her family later said that they did not think Reverend Paris recorded it fairly. So that they disputed that even back in 1692.
As far as writing, reading, I thought they had to know how to read the Bible. So wouldn't they learn to write if they had to everybody had to read the Bible, I thought. Am
Yes.
I wrong in that assumption?
You're right, but that doesn't mean you have to be taught to write. We assume those go hand in hand.
Yeah.
They don't have to. And so with, in particular, women would often be taught to read, but not to write. Yeah.
Okay, do we have another question?
Hello. First of all, I'd like to say great talk. Second, I'd really be interested to hear what you have to say about the reconciliation between Francis Nurse and Putnam Jr., which happened, largely during Joseph Green's reverendship. I'm not sure what the proper word is.
Sure. So with not exactly memorialization, but partly the mending of issues in the community, you have one of the main accusers, Ann Putnam Jr. She was not the first to in Reverend Paris's home, but she was one of the first people outside of that home to become an accuser. Now, she's 12, and out of the almost 200 cases, she is involved in 69. So she is the #1 accuser in terms of like the number of cases she's involved in. So very significant. She later decides that she wants to join the Salem Village Church in the early 1700s. So as the questioner mentioned, it's a new minister. It's Reverend Green. Reverend Paris is gone, finally. He lingers after the witch hunt, even though most people did not want him to continue. And the new minister is trying to bring the community back together. People who hadn't been attending, obviously you wouldn't want to be attending the same worship service as the people who accused your mother of witchcraft, a very understandable position. And Ann Putnam Jr. wants to not just attend the church, which she had been doing, but to join it. In a Puritan church, you had to be voted in as a full member, and whoa, would you get a lot of no votes if you were the #1 accuser during the witch trials. So they worked something out with Rebecca Nurse's son, Samuel, the minister, and her. And she gives an apology in the Salem Village Meeting House. And I really hate the word apology. Everybody calls it her apology. But she never says she did anything wrong. So it can't be an apology then. She says of her time, and it's totally the minister who writes this. Maybe even wrote the entire thing with very little input from her. Uses big theological words, things that she never would have said. But what it says is, she says the devil made her do it. Again, that's a dodge, that's not an apology. And then she also says that her father put her up to it. And he's already dead by that point, so it's really easy to blame the dead. They don't talk back. So that's her moment. The minister wrote it. The minister, we believe, is the one who actually read it. She mentions specifically she feels bad about Rebecca Nurse's case. And that's why it seems like there's some communication with the Nurse family. Why out of all the people, those 69 cases, why does she mention Nurse in particular? And it works. They vote her in, even without ever really apologizing for her actions. So it's a fascinating moment, but no, it doesn't actually count as an apology. It shouldn't be listed among those who do eventually apologize. One of the judges has a heartfelt apology later on. He's kind of the only one that does. But no, I don't really consider that an apology. It was merely a tool to get voted in, and somehow Salem Village votes are in, which is amazing.
Another question?
Whatever happened? Are there any records about what happened to George Jacobs' granddaughter? Because testifying like that, I feel like could really mess someone up.
Yeah, it seems as though she. I think earlier I used the word breakdown, which might be too severe, but has been greatly changed by this experience, or even people do not come out of jail the same way they went in. The jails were so awful. That this has been a real traumatic experience for her, and that it has changed her. With many of the young women, I don't exactly know what happens to them after the witch hunt. They're a lot harder to track down, just like the accusers. There's a whole bunch of them that we assume they got married and left Salem Village, but don't actually know much about them. So we really don't know much about Margaret. From there on out, but is definitely one that you could see having even with her own trauma and what she went through, that she would be a harder person for the community to come to terms with. She returns to her farm, her parents take her back in. That's some family reconciliation, I suppose. And her mother also is described as before the witch hunt, not caused by the witch hunt, as seemingly having some mental issues also. Which is why it's particularly fascinating that George Jacobs' son flees the charge, because leaving his wife behind, not quite sure she could run a family by herself. Never mind, she's been arrested, so she's not looking after the kids, but it's clearly made the point that she could not run a household on her own.
Any more questions? Over there, Alan. Dan, in the meantime, did they have his skull or anything? What was it? What were the bones?
So you did have parts of a skull. You had finger bones. So in like the 20th century, when he's found, it's not a complete skeleton. Of course, it's not. By that amount of time, the smaller bones are gone. But you have several larger bones. You have the front of a skeleton. There are no published photos of it. I saw one once, and so that is where I would get that information. You could definitely tell like arm bones, but it's not much left. It was described. I think it was the doctor who said this, but it's essentially half of it was left. It's the overall gist was it was half missing.
Where exactly was George Jacobs' house? And I assume there's a housing development there now?
Yes. So in Danversport, right along the Peabody line, are you familiar with the Sunnyside Bowling Alley? Back there, you have Jacobs Ave, you have Jacobs Way, and that was all his farm. There's nothing marking the spot of exactly where his house was, but it's at the beginning of the street Jacobs Landing that kind of goes down and is just a cul-de-sac. It would have been at the corner of where that started, and that's kind of as close as we can get to where the house was, which isn't an exact answer.
Okay, should we have one more? Two more.
Go here first.
That was a great speech. I really enjoyed it. What is the population of Salem Village and downtown Salem at this time? Just trying to gauge that. And then my other question was, you said Rebecca Nurse, she went all the way to downtown Salem to go to her church instead of when there was one right next door, which I assume would have taken hours to get to downtown Salem from there. What would have been the difference if they were all Puritan?
Good. So the first question was numbers of people. This is something that's been estimated different ways. And it's kind of hard to track down because, well, of course, there's a list that tells you how many men lived in Salem Village. But children of any gender under the age of majority wouldn't be listed, as well as, of course, adult women. And we have estimates that it's about 400 in Salem Village, about 1,100 in Salem Town. All the estimates are somewhere in that range. Now, out of those 400, let's say, in Salem Village, there were some of those who weren't really in the village. There's a lot of people who lived around the edge that were actually closer to the neighboring town's church and were effectively more involved in that community than they were in Salem Village. So that gets you down lower in terms of the number of people in the meeting house every Sunday who actually knew each other and interacted with one another. So less than that. Oh, and the distance question, yes. So Salem Village gets its own church. It's only set up on a probationary status. It's not a full church for most of her life, which means it did not do the sacrament of communion once a month, like the Puritans did. So we know at least once a month she still went into downtown Salem for that communion Sunday, because that was not available in the village. In terms of her attending the other 3 Sundays out of the 4, we assume that when the Salem Village Church was set up, she would have attended the regular sermons 3 out of the 4 weeks, but on that other one still went into downtown Salem. The church in Salem Village is fully set up in 1689, so it's about 2.5 years before the witch hunt. She may have started going there for that 4th Sunday. We know she never did the paperwork to change her membership, and all we have is the paperwork. So we're unclear there.
Okay, we'll have our last question up here.
The Salem witch hysteria, I heard, ended because people with power or money or influence started getting accused. Is that true?
Not quite. It is true that people with power, money, and influence are accused. The accusations, any social group you can think of. It starts out with the more disadvantaged, but then it spreads. You have people, for example, like as young as 5, as old as however old George Jacobs was, in his 80s. You have men, you have women, the rich, the poor. It's earlier than the end of the summer, I guess, of that year, that they accuse the wealthiest man in Salem, and him and his wife are put in jail. That doesn't stop it, and it keeps going. What really stops it is, again, sort of like movement of the people. That if you're average person in Salem Village, you might believe it, you might not. But when they accuse your mother, you're going to turn into an opponent pretty quick. And so the more accusations you actually get, the more pushback. And you also have, other than Reverend Paris, this is really unpopular with the ministers, which is not often how it's portrayed in a movie or a TV program. They are critics from the beginning. They all believe in witches, but they don't think the court's doing it right. And so it's a process issue. And they really crank up their criticism in the fall, which is really what leads to it ending. Them, by cranking it up and preaching against it, makes it a political issue for the governor. So it is still the rich and important that end it,
Yeah.
but it's pressure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I just want to tell people what's coming up. So next month is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And we're going to do a play right here upstairs in the chapel. It's going to be great. We're going to have, it's called Shadows of 1775. We're going to have the actual accounts of the people who went off to monogamy that day, Arlington. And we're going to have them come back to life and tell their stories. And then the following morning, we're going to be out on the common at about noontime. And we are going to have Martin Herrick, our own Midnight Rider, come, give the alarm. We'll grab our arms, we'll march off to monogamy. We'll come back and we'll do some ceremonies. And then we'll have a band concert after that. So thanks everybody for coming tonight. Stay and have some refreshments or take some home with you.